Good afternoon. Last workshop, we saved the best for last, which is no offense to all the other fabulous workshops we've already had. I'm happy to introduce to you Gisetti and Alexandra Wyman, who are going to be speaking today on the topic, An Unexpected Tomorrow, Picking Up the Pieces After Suicide. Anna is a school counselor and Alexandra is an occupational therapist. So welcome, take it away.
Yes, thank you. I just need to make sure I turn on my microphone. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for the introduction. You can hand them out now. Yeah, that's fine. I'm Anna, and I am in my 11th year as a school counselor in a middle school in a suburb of Denver. And I'm here with my sister Alexandra, who's an OT, as was said, in schools as well. We actually work in the same school district as does our brother, who's a teacher at a high school. So we like to spread the love in our community, working through schools. I'm also the choir director at my church, St. John Chrysostom, which is in Lakewood, Colorado, and where our father is the priest there. So the lens that we bring to you today is through our work professionally and our experiences personally, actually. So talking about suicide is hard enough as it is, and talking about suicide as a last workshop after a long conference can be really hard. We've heard a lot of wonderful speakers throughout the conference, and as we were talking with some people, our brains are a little bit tired, but we ask that you just hang in there for one more hour with us as we walk through this really important topic. Being that it is a tough topic and can be very triggering, please do take care of yourselves. We have done this enough, and we've done enough trainings that we know it can be a very triggering topic, and we never take it personally if you have to take a step out or go walk, take a breath, whatever it is that you need to do to take care of your needs. So our agenda today is this. I'm going to walk you through my story as our personal story of impact by suicide affected me personally and professionally, and walk through some of the lessons learned from our experience. And then Alexandra is going to walk through her side of the story, and then we'll talk through some suicide and mental illness as they relate to each other from a spiritual perspective as well, and then our tips and tricks for moving forward. Our hope for you today is that there's something new. We know a lot of you are in the profession. There's probably not a lot you haven't heard before, but we're hoping there's something you pick up from our story that will help you in your life, working in wherever you work, with your colleagues, with your friends, with your loved ones, or really anyone who crosses your path. We do ask you to keep an open mind as we are telling this story from our perspective, and these really are our story. So I know it's hard sometimes with the lenses we have, but just know that's where we're coming from. Before we dive into my story, we wanted to pose this question. We know people come to the table with a lot of different thoughts and perceptions, perhaps even biases about suicide. So we just wanted to give you a moment to think about. I know it says jot down, but so if you're taking notes, feel free to jot down, or just think, what are some of the ideas about suicide that you bring to the table? So just take a couple moments to think about that. So we titled this session An Unexpected Tomorrow because we had no idea on a fated Saturday morning last summer that we would end up spending the day as we did. Alexandra and I, had plans to go to a playground with her son. We were going to go to the playground, play, go for a walk. It was a beautiful day, and little did we know that rather than doing that, we would find ourselves looking for Sean, who went missing. After hours of searching for him, we would be informed that he took his life. Now, Sean is my brother-in-law and Alexandra's husband, so family member. It's very personal. And that is why we are here today to talk to you about what happened. We're not going to go into details, I promise. I held my sister when she was just 4 hours old. And as I mentioned, our family, we all live, it's kind of silly, we all live within 5 miles of each other, go to the same church, go to football games together, holidays together, family dinners, whatever. So we're a pretty tight-knit family and a major part of each other's lives. And so that, together with the fact that I held her before our mother did, as I've gone through therapy, is part of the reason, I believe, of how I reacted, why I reacted the way I did, and the impact that Sean's suicide has had on my life and me. Speaking of me, here's a little bit of background. So, I'm a school counselor, as I said, 11 years in, 15 years in education. I'm a superhero because that's what they tell me when I go to superhero-themed conferences, right? And I'm sure you hear this too, that you save lives. And so we're put up on this pedestal, which kind of gives us a complex that we're supposed to save people. I have a colleague who even drew a nice little, he's very artistic, and drew a nice little caricature of me as Superwoman, gave me really nice abs, right? So it's everywhere. I have agendas from superhero conferences for counseling and therapy and suicide prevention and you name it. So there's a little bit of that. I'm a suicide prevention trainer and have done this for a while. So since I've been a school counselor, I've been doing suicide trainings for my staff. I worked for about almost 5 years for the state of Colorado in the Department of Public Safety. And I traveled around the state providing suicide prevention trainings and among a myriad of other trainings. So I've done that for quite a long time. I'm ASSIST trained, and I've done Train the Trainer. They're up there, all the acronyms. Prepare, Train, Train the Trainer. Youth Mental Health First Aid, Train the Trainer. QPR, which is Question, Persuade, Refer, trained almost every year. As I mentioned, I provided a number of those suicide prevention trainings around the state, as well as trauma-informed settings, you name it, and in the region and some surrounding states. I worked for Safe to Tell, which is a Colorado-based anonymous reporting system that was created after the Columbine shooting so that students had a space to go and alert adults of things that were going on in the building if they weren't comfortable talking to a human. They had a space to go and report. It was very effective, but I worked there for a while as a trainer in suicide prevention. And through that job, worked also as part of a county suicide prevention task force. And I say this not to be braggadocious, especially in the Temple, but I say this because on August 22nd of 2020, just last year, none of that was of any help. It didn't do anything, no good. So, as I mentioned, we're not going to share the details of what happened on that day. I was with my sister all day, right? We were going to go to the playground. Instead, we ended up at my parents' house, and through there learned pretty early on that Sean went missing. And so we spent the day in high stress, cortisol, adrenaline, sheriff's office phone calls, working to find him and find his exact location. I employed all the tips and tricks I had been trained to do, right? Turning points and hope and help, all the messaging that we've been trained and that I've trained people for how to save lives. We were on the phone, not just with the sheriff's office, but sending texts and phone calls to Sean all day. Messages of love and hope. Could just come home, just give us the opportunity to talk to you. And none of it was working, and in fact, in the end, obviously, none of it worked. The impact on me, and through therapy, right, a therapist named it, which is sometimes really important for us humans to have a label so we know how to fix it. I was extremely jittery, jumpy. We were at the school counseling conference in Colorado just last month, and there was this thing with balloons, and it was a really pretty thing, but the balloons kept popping, and every single time one popped, I was jumping out of my skin, and I kept going what is wrong? This is a year later still, and it's near to the anniversary, I started having all these impacts again. I couldn't sleep, so PTSD symptoms, couldn't sleep, jumpy, foggy, terrible dreams, awful. And there was the physical impact that also comes with grief, just aches and pains and headaches and somatic symptoms. My memory, out the window. Now, my friends will say I don't have a great memory anyway. And so then when you add on trauma and stress, right, it was just even worse. Couldn't concentrate. I didn't want to be alone, and I'm an introvert, right? So I didn't want to be alone, but I also didn't want to be around people. I was very choosy about what people, outside of my family, because we were, again, together a lot in August and September and October of last year. But I was very choosy about being around people I felt were safe. I had to feel that you were safe to me. A lot of our focus, right, we were all grieving about the loss of our husband, brother, son, dad, all of it was happening at the same time. And yet, at times, that was all put to the side because Alexandra and her son were our primary focus, making sure that they were safe, right? We weren't sure about living situation or jobs or any of it. Meanwhile, I had just started a new job at a new school, and we were starting school in pandemic era of online and hybrid and kids and masks and all that kind of stuff. And so there's just a lot of components to be thinking about all at the very same time. And speaking of my job, I went through this still am going through this really interesting dynamic of doubting myself. Everything that I had been taught to do and trained other people to do didn't work. And so I was definitely doubting my ability to do my job, which was extremely difficult because I love my job. I have kids. Kids were doing a project recently, and they were like, "Miss, what's your dream job?" And I'm like, "This is my dream job. I love what I do." Followed very closely, close second, but I'd love to be able to travel the world and get paid for it to review travel companies or food or whatever. But counseling is my jam. It's where I like to be. And so to think that I might not be able to do it, it was kind of devastating. But I was also really embarrassed because what kind of trainer am I? What kind of expert am I in this field if I can't even help save a beloved person? Before Sean died, suicide prevention was my jam. Not that you don't ever want that to be your jam, but it was something I was really good at. I can go and talk to whoever about suicide. Kids knew they could come and talk to me about suicide and feeling sad and depressed and wanting to die. We had talks among family members and friends about suicide. There was several school years where I was doing suicide risk assessments, 1 to 2 a day for up to 2 months. It was really kind of stressful and nutty, but doable. I would provide the training, and it was tiring because it's emotional topic, but doable. And then after Sean died, that fog, it's become a little bit harder to do that again. So I question my ability, can I do, because talking to kids about their feelings and their sad feelings is a major part of what I do for a living. And so to think about, do I have the confidence anymore in my abilities to do that and be efficient, effective in my position? So it's been a long journey for sure. In the immediacy after Sean's death, August, we went back to school last August, and within the first 2 weeks, a suicide assessment came up, and my colleague, my teammate, she's like, "Are you going to be okay doing the SRI?" And I'm like, "Of course I'm going to be okay doing an SRI. Suicide prevention is my jam. Right, I got this, no problem." And we always tag team suicide assessments. And so we asked the questions, we had to call the parents, have a meeting, give the resources, send the student off for a more in-depth evaluation. And I thought, yeah, I'm doing okay, right? Sean just died, but I'm doing okay. I can handle this topic. And then I went home that day and just cried. I sobbed. I wandered around my own living room, blindly sobbing. I cried and cried for that student that day, for the parents that day, for every student I've ever had that I've done an assessment on, for every student I will have, for every family member, anyone who's ever felt sad enough to say, I want to die and not be on this earth anymore. I just cried and cried for hours. And then that also really freaked me out because I was like, oh my God, cannot go on, like I don't want to just survive in my field, I want to thrive. So how do I get my stuff together and figure out how to move on so that I can continue to do what I love? My sister in probably, maybe October, around this time, October, November last year, said, have you heard of this show, Surviving Death? It's on Netflix. And I was like, no. And she's like, it's really good. You should watch it. And I'm like, okay. I wasn't in a space to watch it. And then about January or February of this year, it popped up as one of my, recommendations on Netflix. And I was like, I guess I'll check it out, Lord. Thanks for throwing it my way. So there it was, and I decided to give it a go. And I don't know if you've watched it, but I recommend it. Whatever your thoughts or feelings are about death or after death, this is an interesting perspective. At the very least, it's good to know what people are watching and the different perspectives, like what people are hearing about and the beliefs that people we serve might think about. So I'm watching the show, Surviving Death, and in the second or third episode, there's a grieving mother who's talking to a medium, and she's lamenting the loss of her daughter. And she's really devastated over the fact that she couldn't save her daughter. And I'm watching the show, like, right, death, we're devastated. And the medium says to this mother, this grieving mother, what if you weren't supposed to save him? Now, my eyes popped open and my ears perked up, and I was like, what do you mean you weren't supposed to save him? Everything that I've been taught is that we're supposed to try to save people. We're supposed to save people, not just try, but we're supposed to save people. There's always hope. There's always help. How many suicide prevention places do we go to or hear from that there's always, like, suicide is preventable? That's even a tagline for a place in Colorado. It's preventable. And in many ways it is. Please don't mistake me. I know it is. That's what I do for a living. I know that there are the things that we employ that do work. When I heard this woman say to this grieving mother, maybe you weren't supposed to save him. If someone had said that to me in the months after Sean's death, and Alexandra swears that she did, but if someone outside of her had said that to me, my ears were not ready to hear that message. I was still carrying the burden, the shame, the embarrassment that things that I was trying my hardest to do couldn't save my brother-in-law. But for whatever reason, in January, February of this year, that message came through, and I was like, this is a different perspective. I wonder if there are times when, right, God's plan, we maybe aren't supposed to save a person for whatever reason. God knows I don't. So for me, that was really healing. It allowed me to kind of take these big boulders that I was carrying on my shoulders and lift them for a moment and actually help me think through possibility that while these things that I've been trained to do work in some situations, it's not for me. I'm not a superhero. I'm not superhuman. And maybe it wasn't for me to save Sean that day. We've talked about that too, like, what if we had, right? And I talk about if onlys in a moment, but what if we had saved him that day? Maybe we were just delaying the inevitable, right? So who knows? I don't. Maybe we'll know someday. Maybe I'll care to know. Maybe I won't. Who knows? But that all brings me to this section called Lessons Learned, and we wanted to share with you some of the things that we learned from the impact of Sean's death specifically. Again, our story, our lens. It was really, and I don't use this term lightly, crazy. Not only were we dealing from the trauma and the shock and the grief as the result of Sean's death and suicide specifically, but we were also dealing with a lot of really hard dynamics of people who were grieving, and I'm sure you know people grieve in interesting ways, sometimes really complicated and complex and unkind ways sometimes. And so we were dealing with a lot of complexities and dynamics of people that were around us who were also grieving the loss of Sean. So these come from that. First, let's not, just as a general rule, share this with anybody you feel needs to hear the message. Let's not quote a suicide note in a Christmas card. First of all, that's just tacky. And then second, let's not take that Christmas card and send it to the spouse like they need to hear this message from a suicide note. So let's not do that. Do perhaps instead send a meal or a gift card. And here's what I say, just drop it off. We have this thing about us about being polite. So whenever anyone is going through something, through hard times, we say, hey, we're here for you. I'm here for you. You just let me know if you need anything. You have my number. And right, we never hear from those people. And it kind of lets us off the hook in a weird way, even though we're very well-meaning. So here's what we say. Just drop food off, text, hey, it's on your front porch, and go away. We weren't ready to see people, especially in the immediate aftermath of his death. But we have people who are just dropping stuff off. The meal trains, right? Parishes usually are really great at putting together the meal trains, and everyone has a schedule and drop it off, and to not expect visitation necessarily, but just leave it there, right? Hopefully it's unconditional that you just drop and go and text. I think that was really awesome that we had people who came together to do that in that time, because, right, you think about Maslow and very basic is, yes, food and clothing and shelter, but then the second level is safety, the psychological and physical safety. Well, we were kind of inverted. We were just, are we psychologically and physically safe? Because that's how crazy things got right after Sean died. Are we physically and psychologically safe? And we weren't even thinking about food at that time. So it was really nice that other people jumped in to help us out like that. Please don't feel like you have to know what to say. Sometimes we get really awkward with our words, and I'm sorry for your losses, or whatever the case may be. Again, very well-meaning, but it really is okay. Justin Timberlake has a whole song about it. Instead of saying something, say nothing. Like, it's okay just to say nothing sometimes. It's okay to say, I'm so sorry for your loss. I don't know what to say. Especially with a suicide, it gets really awkward with the shame and blame, but Al will get into that. Do be thoughtful about suicide jokes and remarks. It's interesting, we've talked about this a lot, how much in media, TV shows, music, movies, how many jokes are made about suicide. Wouldn't it be great if we put that energy into like preventative talk or messages of kindness and inclusivity and acceptance and love and grace and compassion? Recently, also on Netflix, I like to watch TV in my downtime because of what I do. But in my downtime, I was again watching Netflix, and I saw Seinfeld was like popped up, and I was like, Seinfeld, I haven't watched Seinfeld in forever. And I was like, I'll give this a go because I remember Seinfeld being really funny. In 9 episodes in the first season, it's something like this, don't quote me on this, even though I know it's being recorded, but in about the first 9 episodes, about 4 or 5 of them had really god-awful crass jokes about suicide. And it hit me in my gut. And I thought, what's funny about this? Now, granted, what was that, late 80s, early 90s, in the 90s? Right, we say it was a different era. Maybe we've learned some, but then why are we putting it back on Netflix for our current people to watch and learn from that? I don't know. It's just something I think about. AJR is a really popular band right now, and they have a song called Bang. I think it was #1 last year. I can't even listen to that song, even though the messaging isn't anything to do really with suicide, I don't think, but the lyrics are like, let's go out with a bang, and that hits me to my core. So just being thoughtful when you're around people who have experienced or been on this end of a suicide about the kind of jokes we make, hand gestures, right? All sorts of things go into that. Don't ask the surviving spouse, partner, anyone tied to the suicide if they knew he or she was depressed or if they saw it coming. They didn't. They really didn't. Alexandra has created a community, and people are being referred to her, other spouses who have lost spouses to suicide, and then through the suicide support group. And 100% of the time, no one knew. So those warning signs that we train about, the notes, not just the notes, the sprinkling, the broadcasting, the giving away of things, the depressive symptoms, none. In every single case, 0 times did anyone know that this was coming or that it was a possibility even on the table. And so, therefore, please don't blame yourself for not having done something or not knowing that it was going to happen, right? Because there isn't always that broadcasting. And what we've heard since Sean died, even if people are depressed or showing depressive symptoms, they've been really good at hiding it so that no one had a clue. do give permission to accept that a person will never be the same, right? This death and death by suicide, the impact of the death by suicide is different than a death by cancer, other illnesses, or a car accident, or natural causes. There are so many more complexities to a death by suicide that leave us thinking like, oh, not just the blame and shame, but now we have to fix this hole for this person that's remaining and surviving. They don't have to be fixed. They lost someone. And then, as I mentioned, it's really easy to if only and go down those bunny trails of if only I'd done this, right? I definitely did that. If only Sean had answered my call or a text. If only he had picked up the phone for anyone who was trying to get a hold of him that day. There are people who are like, I wish I had had the chance to talk to him beforehand, or I wish that we knew, or if only, right? But again, that first of all, when we do that, we kind of take away the free will of the person who made the decision or is going down this path. And then again, we also put ourselves in this superhero complex that we know how to fix it all. And we don't always, and that's okay. And do understand, especially with suicide, there isn't that why. Well, there is a why. The person who died knows why. But we don't, as survivors, right? It's not always explained in a nice little note. It's not tied up in a little package that we get to discover all the whys and the hurts and the whatever it is that led to this decision, which then leaves us filling in the gaps of the stories, right? And coming up with, what do we know? What can we piece together like a puzzle of this person's life that would lead them to such a shocking decision? So that's that. I will say, with all that being given, the do's and don'ts, a lot of words on the page. How have we moved on, right? That's part of this, like how do we pick up the pieces? We've done these things. We cry, we talk more, we cry more. Therapy, we all dove. So since my brother, my sister, and I all work in the district, like I mentioned earlier in a session, the employee assistance program, and we've definitely made use of that and other individual therapists. Group therapy, so I highly recommend if you know someone who has experienced losing a loved one to suicide, finding them a suicide-specific group. Grief groups are awesome, but when there's a death by suicide, again, the complexity, the dynamics, it's really important that they're in a community of other people who have lost a loved one to suicide. TFT is thought field therapy, so it's very similar to EMDR. And we had already known this therapist before Sean died, and so we definitely tapped into him after Sean died, and it was really helpful for me, us, I would say, but for me specifically, to be able to walk through the therapy to separate the emotion from the memory of that day. So now when I think about August 22nd, 2020, when I'm, flooded with the pictures of that day of what happened, I'm not as devastated and I'm not as traumatized every time I think about that day. We started a podcast. It's not on Ancient Faith Radio because, well, when it's called, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. And it's not like really religious based. We talk about our religion sometimes on there, but I don't know if it's really a, quality fit for Ancient Faith Radio. But we started that as like a healing thing for us just to talk about our stories and things we had experienced as a result of his death, and then life in general. So it's funny, I started watching Seinfeld because I used to say, it's like Seinfeld is a show about nothing and everything. And we were like, even if our mom is the only one listening, that would be okay. We write, we puzzle, right? We're all big puzzlers. We present and share our story with hopes that someone would learn something somehow. We continue to love. That's a message I've heard time and time again throughout this conference is love, kindness, compassion, grace for each other, for ourselves, forgiveness, all those things. And it's all still very much a work in progress. Now, I thought about this slide when His Grace was talking on Thursday night, and I was like, I don't have prayer or church up here, nor did I put it in there, but for me, it was just such a given. I was born, well, not born into Orthodoxy, but essentially, like, a few months and then tossed into it, and then raised in the Orthodox Church, attended my father's church with my family. I'm the choir director during the pandemic when only certain people were allowed. It was my dad, my mom, because she's an alto and I needed one, my dad, and my brother who's a reader, and me, right? So it was a family affair for months, right? Great Lent, we started with the Great Lent and then continued on. And then when August hit, it was still that. And so that for me has just been a given to sink myself into the church services. Being in church was always a comfort. Reading psalms, prayers, whatnot. And then in my work world, before I started this new job, remember August of 2020, started at a new school, I actually had like a team of counselors to lean on, which was really cool. I had been in schools for several years where I was the only counselor, and so I had learned to do everything by myself, which also like leads into that superhero complex thing. So I really had to learn how to not do that in this situation, and I feel really blessed, honest to goodness, that I landed in this job at this time so that when this happened and we lost Sean, I had a team of people to lean on and didn't have to worry so much about what was happening at school. And they allowed me the time to breathe and figure things out, take the time to process. And now when I am doing suicide assessments or screeners, as we're calling them this year, I'm able to just do one at a time. And if I need to tap out and have someone tag in to take them for me, I'm working on letting that happen. And then allowing myself to process afterwards, to actually go in my office and shut the door and cry if I need to, or the Calm app. Hopefully you guys know about Calm, and then I'll just watch my scenes and listen to music or do some of the meditation, whatever, some breathing. So that's been also very helpful. We also continue to educate others. There are this book, and this is school specific, so I know it may not apply to you, but you might be interested just in case you want to know and like to read. There's this book called Emotionally Naked, and it's actually a guide for educators to know what suicide prevention looks like in schools. And so when this book was recommended to me, I bought it and I thumbed through it. I'm like, these are all the things that I'm doing. So as a counselor, I didn't find it very not beneficial, but I didn't see anything really new that, I didn't take away much from it. But for people who don't know or are interested, this is a really good guide. Also, and I was talking about this book, I think at lunch the other day, one of my therapists, since we're in the field of counseling and therapy, medical field, that we deal with a lot of trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, all that goodness. My therapist recommended Trauma Stewardship. I don't know if you know about this one. An everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. I've only gotten as far as the foreword and one page into the introduction, but I am stoked about it already. So 2 really good resources when it comes to educating others. Okay. On that note, we are going to switch over to Alexandra, but before we do so, it's been heavy. I've thrown a lot of information at you like through a fire hose. So we're going to do a collective breath together. I'm going to ask that we're going to do box breathing. So we're going to breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4 when you're ready. Okay? Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out for 4. Hold. All right, thank you. Alexandra.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? I was hoping. Okay. As long as that's okay. Hello, good afternoon. That was pretty stellar from Anna, and I love that it encapsulates a lot of those immediate reactions and things that happen. And so I'm just going to give a little bit of my background perspective and then kind of jump in a little bit more into my view of suicide and mental illness, as well as a spiritual perspective. It's kind of a given that this kind of situation would challenge spirituality, and so I have some interesting thoughts about that. So Sean and I met in December of 2017. We were married in 2018, had a beautiful baby boy in 2019. We have a beautiful home. He was a great dad, amazing. He could make our son laugh like no other. I still can't get him to giggle like his dad could. He was a mechanic for high-end European vehicles. He was really sought out in his industry. He could build anything. He just had that mechanical mind. Our son has that, which scares me a little bit because that is not how my mind works. So we're just going to figure it out together. Sean was a professional drummer. He played guitar. He was very handy. He'd be like, oh, I feel like going and I'm going to go paint something. And he'd come upstairs from our basement and be like, here's a painting of the Denver skyline. And I'd go, awesome. I read a book. So he was just really remarkable. He had an ear, it cracked me up. So he could hear a motorcycle or a car go by, and he could tell you the make and model. And we used to laugh about this because he was partially deaf in one ear from some injuries he sustained in the Navy. But it was pretty remarkable. He just had a great sense of humor. He was the life of the party and just loved being around friends and family. And as Anna has mentioned, on August 22nd of 2020, Sean drove up into the mountains of Colorado with his handgun, and he never came home. Talk about the worst day of my life. And that aftermath was complicated, also as Anna has mentioned, with other people's grief. There were threats of legal action against me. There were whispers about custody of my son. Lots of blame to go around. And I'll just say, I don't think suicide, there's no place for blame in suicide at all. And I do not blame his family or friends, whoever wanted to bring this action against me. I do not blame them for what they did. I might be hurt by it, but there just really isn't any place for blame. I also will mention that Sean did have a pretty traumatic childhood. We've talked a lot about trauma throughout this conference. He experienced neglect, abandonment, abuse, rejection, and I'm grateful that I know of those experiences because so many people who have lost a loved one to suicide don't. And this helps me have some understanding. As Anna said, I will never know the answer to why, but I can see, although I do not condone his decision, I do not agree with his decision, I can see how he may have gotten to that decision. And it's not the case for everyone, so I want to honor that as I'm speaking. I think also as practitioners, and specifically Orthodox practitioners, we kind of have an understanding of grief. It's volatility, it's unpredictability, but also it's absolute necessity. So as I mentioned, I want to go into a little bit more of some of the thoughts that I've come across and really been able to dive into since Sean's death. So as other sorts of background, I'm fascinated by anything neuroscience. I have my master's thesis I did on neuroplasticity in stroke survivors. I'm completely fascinated with neuroscience-based research that looks at how the ages of 0 to 14 for an individual are extremely crucial in how we create the blueprint that helps us with just dealing with life, with problem solving, with conflict management, how we view ourselves as individuals. And those ages of 0 to 14 are very crucial. This doesn't mean that we obviously experience traumatic events at any point in time in our life, but those ages of 0 to 14 really set that tone for how we're going to handle those things. And when you are that little, right now as an adult, I might be able to understand the intent in a situation. I might be able to try and look at it from different perspectives to have more understanding. I might be in my self-worth enough that I can ignore what someone else is saying. But at that age, when we have these events, it's less about what the traumatic event is and more about the impact on our little bodies when we're that young. So for instance, when I was 6, I was in the church hall with some event. I don't even remember what the event was. And this man, to me at 6 years old, I felt like he was 80 or 90 years old, and he just towered over me. He was probably only 40, but for my little self, that's what it seemed like. And we were doing some sort of event in the church hall, and he came over to me and he took some food away from me, and he said, "Don't eat that, you're going to end up fat." And I didn't even remember this until I was in my 20s and started really looking at my own personal growth and really trying to take myself to the next level spiritually. And I realized that interaction set a tone for me in my own body image, in my own understanding and relationship with food, and how I view my own health. 30 seconds, less than 30-second interaction, and it had that kind of impact. My point is that the messaging we interpret, no matter the intent, I'm sure he thought he was really trying to help out this little chubby 6-year-old girl. His intent was to help, but myself as my little being, this instance, lay a foundation. And that's what happens, and it can have lifelong consequences. So as Anna has also mentioned, several times since John has died, I've been asked, did I know he was depressed? Or was he in therapy? Did he take antidepressants? And my answer is no. Did he have depressive symptoms? Yes. I've also been told that I must now be an expert in mental illness because my husband died by suicide, and I'm also like, nope, not sure about that one either. I do think this has really made me start to dive into that. How do we go, why am I being asked this? What really is going on? How did we get to this point that this awesome guy decided that the only choice he had left was to take his own life? And so I don't believe that suicide is the result of mental illness. Now, bear with me for a second on this one. Is it a component? Yes. But I think that there are 6 areas that I would call harmonious well-being. And in those 6 areas would be nutritional, physical, emotional, mental, cellular, and spiritual. And I think that it's the culmination of these 6 areas and difficulties in those 6 areas that can contribute to how we are in our overall well-being. The cellular piece, I think, is really crucial because this is the one I've been talking about from the ages of 0 to 14. We know, I think we skirt around it, and we have EMDR, as we've said, thought field therapy, hypnosis comes and addresses this, but we don't talk about it enough, we don't address it enough, and we're not actually having those conversations or figuring out how to handle it. Just like a quick side note, I heard of someone else recently who actually was in Sean's family who also apparently attempted suicide, and she was put on a hold. They found her, everything was okay. And my whole thing was, I hope she gets the help that really gets to the root of the problem, not just gets her out of the hold and gets her back into her daily life, but how do we get to the root of why she got to that point? To say that someone had some dark thoughts and ended their life just isn't, it's not fair to the individual. It just kind of waters down their life to, oh, you just couldn't handle it. As a society, we end up going, well, why didn't you just think good thoughts? Get a pill for that. Go to a therapist. Seek help. See some affirmations. And we as humans need to know the why. We need the answers. This helps us be able to take our labels and say, well, now that we have the label, we know what to prescribe in order to fix it. Fits nicely, as Anna mentioned, our nice little box that we can address it, but I just think it's so much more complex than that. We need a chance to rationalize the irrational. Sean didn't just have some bad thoughts and then go take his life. As I mentioned, from an early age, he was told and treated like he was defective and broken and could not be fixed. So his whole mind and body and soul believed that he was born wrong and that nothing could be done for him. He had multiple events in those early ages that contributed, that were traumatic and left a lasting impact on him. And yet that impact of his trauma was not overt. So I think that's another piece we like. We like when the trauma is really blatant and overt because then we know how to label it. Then we know how to address it. But his wasn't overt. Looking at the flower, you can see that any piece of the flower that might not be flourishing can impact the rest of it. So Sean's cellular piece was highly impacted, his mental and emotional. Now, don't get me wrong, no one is ever at 100%. I think we can all agree that. But for him, I think keeping everything together, these other areas were compensating, and it just got to be so much so that everything started to feel like it was coming down around him. And the only choice that he felt to end his pain and suffering was to end his life. I've also been asked about Sean accessing resources like therapy and pharmaceuticals. And as I try and understand trauma more, I believe that he just didn't think those things would work for him. He knew about them, but that they wouldn't work for him because he had already, part of that messaging was that they wouldn't work for him. So why spend time and money trying to do things that wouldn't work for him? Bessel van der Kolk, which I know we've heard a little bit throughout the conference here, he's got his book, which is awesome, The Body Keeps the Score. Anna and I had the privilege of doing his trauma training. And I posed this exact question. You have an individual who obviously experienced trauma. They don't feel that they can access these resources, so what do you do? And his response that, one, if an individual is still within that survival mode, the lizard brain, you can't. You have to try and provide some resources for that individual that almost without them knowing can get them out of that in order to start to access. So yoga is one of those things. There have been studies that have been done about yoga and trauma, that it naturally helps the brain calm down out of survival mode so that the individual can start to see that those resources are available. For Sean, we just ran out of time before we could even try and get to a point that we could introduce some resources for him, or at least to attempt to get him out of that survival mode. So being that we've had a lot of information, one of the things either you can talk to your neighbor or just think about in your own practice, what sort of resources have you used to help an individual? Now, often if people are coming to us, it means that they've had those moments of not being in that survival mode and can access help. Or if you can think about other ways to be able to help someone kind of get out of that traumatic state so that they know that some options are available. So I'll just give a minute for you to think about that or talk to your neighbor.
And this is one of my favorite visuals of transforming trauma because it has Optimus Prime going from like battle mode into rollout mode, right? So as you think about how do we get from lizard brain, survival brain to working to prefrontal cortex, logic, rationale, can work myself through a situation.
Okay. I'll just keep going. So now on more to the spiritual. So since Sean died, I've really had to evaluate my relationship with God, my spiritual beliefs, and my relationship with death. So often when we think or talk about death, we have death over here. Oh, it's over here on this side. Death over here on this side, and then suicide over here. Death of all kinds generates a response of compassion, whereas suicide elicits a response of judgment. How selfish. I can't tell. I always heard that. How selfish. How dare Sean abandon our son and me? How cowardly. There's even a component of, well, if you took your own life and didn't wait for God's time, then you don't deserve God's mercy. Just as an example, I had this woman, sorry. I'm not used to this whole microphone thing. But I had to go into the DMV, change the registration of one of our vehicles into my name. Boy, did I not realize what was going to happen. So I sit down and I had to give the death certificate to the lady, and it had how he died. Not all death certificates do, but it had the cause of death on there. And I'm looking through like the really pretty fancy license plates. I'm like, there's nothing for suicide awareness. And she looks at me and she goes, oh, is that how he died? I was like, yes, it is. Little did I know she just needed an opening to let me know her thoughts on suicide. 7 minutes going on and on, how it is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Why can't people just get over it? It's very selfish. Now, she doesn't know anyone who died by suicide, but she knows someone who knew someone who knew someone who remarried, and a couple months after remarrying took his life. So clearly it was the wife who did it, which that is also part of my own story. It was a question of, it must have been my marriage that killed Sean. And I sat there going, normally I might excuse myself, but she was holding my registration hostage. So I couldn't exactly ask for it because I was like, I think I have to let her get it out. Her theme throughout was just get over it. Her daughter was in middle school and struggling, get over it. She was bullied as a child, just get over it. She doesn't understand why people can't just get over it. I did eventually get my registration, so that was good. And I say waddle, Anna says wobbled. It took me a little bit to get out of the DMV, but I realized that this is something where, as common as suicide is, that everybody has opinion about it, whether or not that they've experienced it. I would challenge these ideas, though, and these projections and judgments to say that individuals who die by suicide deserve just the same amount, if not more, of compassion from us. In fact, I would say it isn't selfish. Another theme that I've gotten from my suicide support groups, from therapists who work with individuals who were contemplating suicide, is that a big part of it is to not be a burden to the people they love. Their pain is so great, they do not want to burden the people who are left behind. When it comes to the selfishness, the cowardice. It takes a lot to end a life of any kind, so I'm not sure how it's cowardly, because to go through what you do to take a life, to me, I don't find that cowardly. It takes a lot of courage, I would say. And again, I do not condone any of this. In fact, I mentioned once that I wish that suicides for all mankind ended with Sean's death. It didn't work that way, because 3 weeks after he died, I was called from a friend asking if I could help another woman who had just lost her husband to suicide. I tend to think of a person ravaged by cancer. They just want the pain to end, right? They may ask for increased amounts of morphine to end their physical pain. I watched my grandmother go through this. There is nothing but compassion and sympathy and empathy for an individual who is dying from cancer. Even a DNR. We may not agree with an individual who has a DNR, but we respect that they do because it is their choice. We honor these choices because we understand them. We have empathy and compassion when there is a tangible cause for the pain and suffering. Sean had his own dis-ease, and it was not just mental, it was not just spiritual, but a disharmonious dis-ease. In a way, all areas of his wellness were ill. His pain was not on the outside for others to see, but his mind, body, and soul were just as ravaged. His choice was no different than a DNR or extra morphine. We all were just not prepared for it. Again, please know that I don't agree. I don't know how many times I can say that. If him staying here on earth meant that he had to stay in that pain, I wouldn't want that. That wouldn't be fair to him. When we assign approval or disapproval, compassion or judgment, we are taking away an individual's free will. Anna mentioned that as well. I've had several discussions about the Orthodox perspective of death and suicide, and I agree that Sean's free will and the choices he believed were available to him were skewed just off of the experiences he had in life, just as it is for all of us. So those years of 0 to 14 create that blueprint. Now, it doesn't mean that blueprint is set in stone. That is my whole point, is that there are therapies and there are resources to help us be able to peel back those and heal the messages that impact us in a negative manner. It's that imprinting that we have. But it creates our idea of what those choices are. How often do we hear of atrocious events and think, I would never do that? Or you hear things in the news, I wouldn't do that? How often do we remark how clearly there are other choices someone could have chosen, but it was their selfishness, it was their egocentrism, their lack of compassion that made them choose the choice that we disapprove. And by the time Sean died, I suspect that the only choice that presented in front of him to end his pain and suffering and to give him that quiet mind was to end his life. So in the first year after Sean died, I received a pretty loud message. I believe it came from him. And basically it said, essentially all that really matters is love, compassion, and forgiveness. This isn't just for those who we already love, those we care about, those who we like. The goal is for love, compassion, and forgiveness for all, no matter political or religious affiliation, no matter socioeconomic or cultural background. In her book, Dark Side of the Light Chasers, Debbie Ford discusses how if we are to practice love and compassion, we need to be able to do it for even the worst people on earth. That one's really hard for me, I'll admit. Even in my own journey, there are some people where I've said, I'm not even sure I'm going to heal enough to forgive them, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try. So my question to all of us as Orthodox Christians is how can we start to transform our discussion and perspective, especially on suicide, to include more compassion? How can we transition from reactions of anger and judgment to ones of love and empathy? How do we shift from seeing only the darkness around suicide to start to see God's love and mercy? I immediately saw God's love and mercy sprinkled all over my situation. I didn't want to, and it took me quite a while. I was pretty angry, so I needed to get through that in order to see that. But a couple of things that happened immediately. Sean did not die at home, so I did not find him. We were trying to expand our family and have a second child, and I was not pregnant. I have had an opportunity to go to where he died, not the specific spot, but to where he died, and I got to see what he saw as the last thing, and it's beautiful. And I'm grateful that out of all the things in this life on earth that he could have seen, he got to see some beauty before he died. There is absolutely no good that comes from him dying, but there could be and is some good out of the journey and aftermath that I'm experiencing and being able to go through. As someone who is kind of lost a little bit, I'm finding my purpose and being able to share with you all today. I heard this quote, and you'll have to forgive me because I don't know who said it. So if you do, please reach out and let me know. But it was that life doesn't happen to you, it happens for you. It took me a while to start understanding that a little bit more. Sean's death definitely shook up my life. I was speaking last night about that, how sometimes God just goes, oh, you're on the wrong path, here you go. And I don't necessarily agree with how this was shaken up, but I'm going to embrace it. And so I get this opportunity to share and hopefully empower more people to talk about suicide, to be able to share their stories. And so I'm hopeful that as a society and as Orthodox Christians, we can start to soften our hearts toward those who suicide, and that each of us can find our own light and let it shine through unconditional love, continuous compassion, and unyielding forgiveness. Now I'm going to switch it over to Anna.
Oh, no? Yes. Okay. We have a few minutes, and I know there's a little bit of a break before Vesper starts, but I'm going to try and make this quick as we talk about moving forward. We wanted you to reflect on your scope, your lens, your life, and hopefully there's something you heard today. Maybe it was different. Maybe you didn't agree with it all. That's okay. At least we're having the conversation, and we're ever grateful that we got to speak in front of you today. Thank you all. So just be thinking about what is a takeaway for you today that you can go back and apply in your setting, whether it's a personal, professional life, whatever the realm. Our final thoughts, and I'm not going to read all the words, but most of them, because I think they're really important, is one, we just want to continue educating that we can't minimize a death by suicide to one event, DMV lady, or to one cause, one mental illness, right? As we have learned from Sean and a myriad of other people, it's way more complex than that, and it's not fair to the person just to say it was this one little thing. We want to keep talking about it so that we can reduce stigma. Alexandra talked about that. Stigmas come up quite often. How can we keep raising the banner, blowing our horns and saying, like, it's okay to not be okay and to ask for help? Let's talk about it. Focus on the 0 to 7. I think after this and talking to school people, I really want to get on the bandwagon or start a bandwagon. If you want to join me, you're welcome, to shout that we need more mental health supports for our little guys. We, have school counselors at the high school level enough to, get our kids to post-secondary options, and then middle school, a little fewer, that's where I am. And then in our elementaries, we're really lacking a lot. And if that crucial messaging is happening from 0 to 7, 0 to 14, then right, as adults, we're dealing with messaging from those years, and wouldn't it be great just to help our little guys tackle that a little bit more as they're little people? Building capacity for people to work through the hard feelings. I don't think this just applies to kids, but also adults. Like, how do we sit with sadness or anger or frustration or disappointment and know that those are okay feelings, they're okay to have, and we don't need to sit with them forever. We're going to feel them and let them go. But that when we feel them, we don't jump to, I don't like this and I want to die. So how can we, and it's a question I have too, like, how can we be better at building capacity for going through the muck and saying it's okay to go through the muck without, and I dare say, and if you're going to disagree, that's okay, but often we have heard sometimes the messaging is prayer and fasting. Now, I know the Bible says that, right? Like, it is great guidance, and there are situations which call for prayer and fasting to help us get through situations. I might posit and argue, maybe unfavorably, that sometimes it's not the end-all be-all, and we need some additional supports to help us get through the hard feelings. Understand we're not here to fix the problem. That superhero complex, we can't do it all. We're not supposed to. God can. We are here to help the person help themselves, right? When there are those moments of despair, how do we help? Right? If you ever think about a situation where you have felt severe despair or been in that dark place, I don't know how many of you have run to other people for help, but I sure haven't. When I'm in deep, deep despair, I sit there and I'm like, gosh, I don't know how I'm going to work through this or get out. And so I don't reach out to my supports, as Alexandra said. I know they're there. I'm a professional in the field. I know what they are, but I'm not in a space to get that there. So what do I do in those moments of deep, dark despair to help pull myself out into light? You can do all the things and a suicide still may happen. Medical professionals, you can do all the things and we still lose patients. And so what do we do? What systems do we have and support set up to help us pick up the pieces when these things do happen, because life happens. And then I really do love that hopefully we're going to start to include the cellular petal in our flower of people, because it's real, it's science, it's real. So we want to continue to do that as well. Feel free to take a picture. I put the links in here. I don't know if the PowerPoint's going to be available, but there are a bunch of resources. And I put, my school district has a really cool virtual calm room. When we went virtual, they put all these virtual resources, and I was going to pull it up. We don't have time. But if you don't already, with your practice or whatever, your personal pages or your churches, have a space like a virtual calm room. I was walking over here on the way to do this presentation. I'm like, St. John's needs to have a virtual calm room, and we need to have mental health resources posted up on our website. I can't just talk the talk. I got to walk the walk. And so when we get back, not tonight because it'll be late, but tomorrow, I need to figure out, like, how do we make that accessible for our people? So it's pretty cool stuff, right? And there's stuff there for each of the petals. Any questions or comments for the good of the order? We'll be here for a minute if you don't want to ask your question in front of everybody, but we are here. Oh, now I hope I can answer.
Just a couple of quick comments. First of all, that took a tremendous amount of courage. God bless you. Secondly, I can't speak for the church, but for me as a priest, I'm with you on this. As a military chaplain and as a pastor, this is the best presentation on suicide that I've ever seen. Third, cellular. I told a woman recently who was unwanted from birth, from conception, that her trauma was in utero, and I said, and it's in your cells. And I heard myself say that, and I said, that can't be true because all of our cells exchange over the years. And I thought, well, wait a minute, cells communicate, and they just hand it off. So as the body goes through its transformation, the cellular embodiment of trauma gets just handed on to the next blood cell, the next neuron, the next whatever. They just kind of hand it to the next person coming in to take their shift. So that was really helpful. I'm like, wow.
That's awesome.
So thank you for talking about that. I think that petal is very important, and it's not well represented. And lastly, singular answers to multivariate situations are always false. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
With fear and trembling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Most sincerely. In May of 2007, when it was still known as SCOBA, the bishops offered a pastoral letter about suicide that is really, really good and really right. As a pastor, I've dealt with a lot of suicides. My kids have dealt with suicides. It's very commonplace. But if there's something I think that we as a church need to understand, face all of us, because this is really an us moment, we really need to embrace the theology of brokenness. Deacon John, priest of Yeast, has written about it. Others have. And while it's easy to sort of freeze that in amber as a nice, tidy thought and a theological precept, the fact is its presence is ubiquitous in our communities. And the church does herself a disservice, I guess small c, in this regard, when we kind of choose not to lean into the reality of that. And speaking with His Eminence about some pastoral issues here, I made the point, that Your Eminence, there are no more shiny, happy people to put in our churches because we are all broken. But Jesus heals our brokenness with His brokenness in a literal way. So I think that we as a church have some accounting to do about that. And though I know that you are right when you said it, it devastates me that it is correct when you say that we treat deaths different from suicide. In my pastoral life, I have never been denied the ability to do a funeral by my hierarchs in the event of a suicide, not even one time, because that brokenness is always present. So Again, thank you. I am stunned at your ability to do what you've done. And my prayer is that we can learn from that and understand the depth of compassion that sometimes we like to put aside and make things tidy so that no one else ever has to go through what you went through at the DMV. Anyway, thank you. I love you guys.
Oh, thank you.
We did, there are papers with the resources. Some are Colorado specific that Alexandra put together. What we realized right after Sean died, no one came to her and said, these are the things you have to do. He was a veteran. These are the places you have to call to get a human being. While you're dealing with everything else and a toddler, you don't have to be on hold for hours waiting for a human to talk to about something. So there was no one to help her through that. So she compiled a list of resources or things to think about. God willing, you never need it. Sometimes at conferences you get papers and you shove them away or put them somewhere. And so hopefully you can do that with this one and never need it. But in the event that you do, you have some considerations and then some thoughts on the other side also.
I gave my mic away, but my contact information is there. And you can, it is. Here, I was just going to say, if you come across someone who is having to go through some of the business of this, I am a resource to kind of help guide someone on what to do, and it is different per state, but my information is there as another resource for that.
And if you like the message, we're not really awesome at promoting ourselves, and this is really new for both of us to do, but we want to be a resource to other people as well. So if you know of people, just reach out. We're available for whatever, questions, comments, suggestions.
Wow. I am a little speechless. As a psychologist, of course, I go and do CEs all the time. And in the last 6 months, because of a suicide in our parish, I thought I should learn some more and get up to date. And so I attended a seminar at APA on helping communities cope in the aftermath of suicide. I watched another one on helping clients with chronic suicidality, but this one, your presentation delivered with such grace. Oh my goodness. It makes it a little more real for a clinician to not have it be out there in the hypothetical. So thank you.